I stood in the doorway, the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest like a stone. The room was warm with the hum of conversation and clinking glasses, until they saw me. Every smile froze. Every voice fell silent. And there she was, my best friend, perched on the arm of my husband's chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as though she belonged there. The image seared itself into my mind with cruel clarity. They didn't even move apart when they noticed me. If anything, his arm slid more comfortably around her waist, as if to make a point. For a heartbeat, I thought I might collapse. But the part of me that had been honed by years of quiet observation and unspoken slights held me upright. I set my bag down on the console table, removed my coat with deliberate slowness, and looked around at the gathered faces, his family, my so-called friends, people I had fed, sheltered, and defended more times than I could count. They all looked away. Only then did I speak, my voice steady enough to scare even myself. I said, "Don't stop on my account. I am Olivia, 32 years old, and in that moment I understood something I had never fully grasped. Betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from the ones who've studied your kindness long enough to know exactly how to weaponize it." That night should have been about something else entirely. I had planned to show everyone a surprise, the little holiday project I'd been working on in secret for weeks. Instead, the surprise was mine. It wasn't just that they were together. It was that they didn't even try to hide it. The room had an unspoken consensus. The problem wasn't what they had done, the problem was that I had walked in and seen it. I grew up believing in the quiet dignity my grandmother, Eleanor, had embodied. She raised me for most of my childhood after my parents' marriage collapsed under the weight of their own selfishness. Her house smelled of cinnamon tea and wood polish, the kind of home that felt like a safe harbor no matter how rough the waters outside. She'd say, "You don't measure people by how they treat you when the sun is shining. You measure them by how they treat you when they think you can't give them anything." She taught me restraint, the art of listening more than speaking, and the power of walking away without making a scene. But she also taught me that a time always comes when silence stops being strength and becomes complicity. Looking at the room that night, I saw my grandmother's words come alive in their ugliest form. The people who had shared my table, my home, my trust, watching me like I was the intruder in my own life. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply turned toward the door again, because I needed to think. The only sound behind me was my best friend's soft laugh, too brittle, too loud for the moment, and my husband's low murmur to someone else, something I couldn't make out. But I didn't need to. Their body language told me everything. As I stepped outside into the cool night, the air hit my lungs like ice. That was when I remembered the nanny cam. It had been installed months earlier, my idea, because we'd had issues with missing packages and a neighbor's complaint about someone entering our porch at odd hours. I had forgotten about it entirely, until that moment. And suddenly, I knew exactly what my holiday project was going to be. I walked down the driveway, each step sharpening my resolve. The party was still in full swing behind me, but I already saw the ending. Not the end of the marriage, that much was obvious. But the end of something deeper, something they had never even realized they'd taken from me. When I returned, it wouldn't be with tears. It would be with proof. And they wouldn't just see what they'd done, they would see it in front of everyone they had hoped to keep it from. I didn't yet know that the footage held more than I was expecting. And once I played it, there would be no way to unsee it. I stood in the doorway, the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest like a stone. The room was warm with the hum of conversation and clinking glasses, until they saw me. Every smile froze. Every voice fell silent. And there she was, my best friend, perched on the arm of my husband's chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as though she belonged there. The image seared itself into my mind with cruel clarity. They didn't even move apart when they noticed me. If anything, his arm slid more comfortably around her waist, as if to make a point. For a heartbeat, I thought I might collapse. But the part of me that had been honed by years of quiet observation and unspoken slights held me upright. I set my bag down on the console table, removed my coat with deliberate slowness, and looked around at the gathered faces, his family, my so-called friends, people I had fed, sheltered, and defended more times than I could count. They all looked away. Only then did I speak, my voice steady enough to scare even myself. I said, "Don't stop on my account. I am Olivia, 32 years old, and in that moment I understood something I had never fully grasped: betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from the ones who've studied your kindness long enough to know exactly how to weaponize it." That night should have been about something else entirely. I had planned to show everyone a surprise, the little holiday project I'd been working on in secret for weeks. Instead, the surprise was mine. It wasn't just that they were together. It was that they didn't even try to hide it. The room had an unspoken consensus. The problem wasn't what they had done, the problem was that I had walked in and seen it. I grew up believing in the quiet dignity my grandmother, Eleanor, had embodied. She raised me for most of my childhood after my parents' marriage collapsed under the weight of their own selfishness. Her house smelled of cinnamon tea and wood polish, the kind of home that felt like a safe harbor no matter how rough the waters outside. She'd say, "You don't measure people by how they treat you when the sun is shining. You measure them by how they treat you when they think you can't give them anything." She taught me restraint, the art of listening more than speaking, and the power of walking away without making a scene. But she also taught me that a time always comes when silence stops being strength and becomes complicity. Looking at the room that night, I saw my grandmother's words come alive in their ugliest form. The people who had shared my table, my home, my trust, watching me like I was the intruder in my own life. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply turned toward the door again, because I needed to think. The only sound behind me was my best friend's soft laugh, too brittle, too loud for the moment, and my husband's low murmur to someone else, something I couldn't make out. But I didn't need to. Their body language told me everything. As I stepped outside into the cool night, the air hit my lungs like ice. That was when I remembered the nanny cam. It had been installed months earlier, my idea, because we'd had issues with missing packages and a neighbor's complaint about someone entering our porch at odd hours. I had forgotten about it entirely, until that moment. And suddenly, I knew exactly what my holiday project was going to be. I walked down the driveway, each step sharpening my resolve. The party was still in full swing behind me, but I already saw the ending. Not the end of the marriage, that much was obvious. But the end of something deeper, something they had never even realized they'd taken from me. When I returned, it wouldn't be with tears. It would be with proof. And they wouldn't just see what they'd done, they would see it in front of everyone they had hoped to keep it from. I didn't yet know that the footage held more than I was expecting. And once I played it, there would be no way to unsee it. Shame didn't wash over me, it washed past me. What stayed was the sharper thing, a clean edge I could set my palm against without flinching. I tapped play. The frame held steadier than I felt. He entered alone at first, coat slung over his shoulder, the familiar laziness in his stride. He glanced toward the hallway the way a person glances at a mirror they are used to lying to. 30 seconds later, she slipped inside, all reflex and no guilt, and went directly to the bowl where we keep spare keys. The camera sensor breathed awake as her hand hovered, then closed. When the keys vanished into her pocket, a collective ripple moved through the room, fingers tightened around glasses, a throat cleared too loudly, someone whispered a word that sounded like wow and tried to swallow it again. I could feel the air changing around me, the pressure recalibrating as people began doing the quiet math of self-preservation. Every person in that room was choosing a version of the next hour that would be easiest to live with tomorrow. He said, "Turn it off." I replied, "No." It was almost anticlimactic to say it. The smallest refusal I've ever made, and somehow the one that shifted the weight of the house onto its other foot. The chorus began like a well-rehearsed hymn. "Don't do this here. This isn't the way. Let's talk like adults." They weren't talking about adultery. They were talking about the mess I was making by naming it. I kept my gaze on the screen to save myself from the temptation of scanning faces for sympathy. That was the habit I was most in danger of slipping back into, the search for one forgiving expression to climb into and hide. I didn't come here to hide. The clip's timestamp edged forward. In the reflection of the curio cabinet across from the entryway, a trick of glass I hadn't appreciated until tonight, there was a blur of motion, then a fast kiss, then as they separated, his hand dipped to the console drawer where we keep small things that matter only to us, spare checks, stamps, my grandmother's handwritten list of the holiday spices she refused to run out of. He lifted the drawer like it belonged to him more than to me. He said, "Enough." I replied, "Almost." The remote was warm under my palm. Paige hadn't moved from my side, she was a quiet hinge holding the moment where I'd placed it. A hand reached toward the television from across the room, then retracted when it realized the indecency of touching what wasn't theirs again. Pressure comes in many dialects. The room tried all of them. "You're better than this, Olivia. You'll regret making a spectacle. This is beneath you. She's your friend. You must have misunderstood." The word friend landed between my ribs and knocked once. Then it died in my chest like a moth. I pressed play on the last segment I had cued, the one with the ring. The footage was nothing more than a pivot, a sweep of her hair, a hand catching the light, but the tiny stone flickered with a familiar glint, and my grandmother's face came back to me as if she'd been standing there the whole time, gently impatient with all this foolishness. I heard someone inhale through their teeth in a way that told me they weren't sure whether to be outraged or jealous. Both were useless to me. He said, "You're filming our guests without consent. That's illegal." Paige said, evenly, "Not in her own home and not in a common entryway where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. We can debate manners. We can't debate the facts." He shot her a look that said he didn't invite lawyers to this party. She returned it with the kind of contained calm I recognize in surgeons and pragmatic women, people who are not here to save you from yourself. The room exhaled an argument about surveillance and trust. It was inventive in the way that self-defense can be. Someone decided to place their drink loudly on the table for punctuation and then had to mop up the splash with a cocktail napkin. "It would have been funny yesterday." He said, "We've been unhappy for a long time." I replied, "Speak for yourself." A voice from my left, one I'd known since college, tried to soften the edges. "We can't reduce complicated adult choices to clips on a screen, Liv." That was the nickname they used when they wanted something from me, shorter, cuddlier, a syllable without edges. Paige's phone vibrated with a message that she tilted toward me. A noise complaint from a neighbor had pulled patrol 2 blocks down. If this got louder, it wouldn't just be social. It would be a report. I didn't know what louder would look like until the third act did what third acts do. It arrived uninvited and carrying its own fire. She stepped forward. Not close enough to stand next to him, not far enough to pretend she was uninvolved, and lifted her chin in a way that looked like bravery if you wanted it to. I caught the faintest tremor in her hand when she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She said, "I'm pregnant." The silence made a different sound then. It grew teeth. That was the twist the room had been waiting for. You could feel the relief of a narrative that made sense again, a story they could hold, whisper about later, pick apart for seasoning. Some faces softened with automatic pity, others sharpened with the thrill of scandal. The math changed again. Every person recalculated their empathy budget. He looked at me like a man presenting evidence for his defense. "See? Life is complicated. See? There are reasons." I didn't reach for rage. I reached for the small, steady place inside me that has survived worse mornings. If there was a life involved now, this wasn't about spectacle. It was about the line between harm and consequence. He said, "We didn't know how to tell you." I replied, "You just did." Paige's hand barely brushed my elbow, an anchoring. Her eyes asked a question she didn't need to say out loud, "Do you want to pivot?" We could have walked away, right then. We could have folded the night back into its box and let the room burrow into the easy story. Betrayed wife, grasping mistress, hapless man. It sells well. It is also, invariably, a lie told to create an audience. There was a different story in my phone. The app that collected familiar faces had produced another line of thumbnails when the ring flashed. Patterns call to other patterns. I opened the notifications with my thumb, not to feed the room but to be sure I wasn't missing a piece on the board. 2 weeks earlier. Midday. A weekday I was out at meetings. The entryway again. He came in with a messenger bag. She came in 5 minutes later with a small lockbox I recognized from the top shelf of my closet, an old tin where I kept documents that belonged to my grandmother. Birth certificates from a time they were calligraphed, the deed to a plot my grandmother never sold because paper needs another paper to hold it in place. In the reflection I could see the tin open, papers fanned across the console for a breath, then folded into the bag. The camera didn't have audio. It didn't need it. The house had been a set for more than one plot. My mistake had been thinking the genre was only romance. The B story was older and colder: access, assets, leverage. I could feel the room watching my face as if it might tell them how to feel about theirs. I didn't flinch, but I let myself feel it so that I would remember this later, when everything settled and I might be tempted to soften history to make it easier to sleep with. The betrayal had most likely started with desire. It had matured into something transactional. The pressure doubled when someone's voice, hers, cut toward anger, the first truly hot thing in the room all night. She said, "You're going to destroy him over a mistake? Over one mistake? You cannot humiliate him like this." I replied, "There are at least 12. I realized, as I said it, that I'd been counting without meaning to. Dates had arranged themselves into a bleak calendar in my mind. Weeks were flagged like overdue bills. Another voice chimed in. His sister, all spit-polished righteousness. "This is cruel, Olivia. Whatever is wrong in your marriage, this is you. This is vindictive." The word hung there, looking respectable in its pearl necklace. Paige stepped forward 1/2 step, which in legal language is a paragraph. Paige said, "You are excusing theft, trespass, and fraud because the truth offends your sense of decorum. No one is touching him. No one is raising a hand. We are looking at a television. Cruelty is a choice. So is accountability." For the first time I watched his face when someone else drew a boundary around me. It startled him, like watching a dog encounter a mirror. He didn't know what to do with the shape of his own reflection. He said, "You've been distant." I replied, "I've been working." We didn't have the same dictionary. The room tried one more angle. Pity for her. Rage at me for refusing to collapse into pity as if that were the only moral move available. Respectable people love nothing more than a woman who forgives in public. It makes their own compromises feel holy. A friend of his, party friend, not hospital friend, offered a little closing argument dressed up as concern. "You don't want to be the woman who records people. It's a bad look." He meant, you don't want to be the woman we can't trust to protect our comfort even when we're wrong. He was right. I didn't. My phone vibrated again with something practical, grounding. A bank alert, password change initiated. Not mine. Joint. A muscle in my back tightened, then let go. The tin. The documents. It wasn't only about romance or narrative or pity. The leak had filings. I handed the phone to Paige. Her eyes sped over the notification, then lifted back to the screen. She was already moving 3 steps ahead in a game I had only just realized we were playing. Paige said, "We need to talk somewhere quiet." I replied, "Soon." He stepped closer then, the first real approach he dared since the clips began. The room held its breath, eager for a hand on an arm, a gesture that could be translated into "See, she's irrational," or "See, he's still a good man." He smelled like the cologne I bought last December because I thought we were celebrating something. I registered it and filed it away. He said, "Lower, if you do this, I'll never forgive you." I replied, quieter, "You already didn't." The words slid out of me without malice. They weren't a dagger. They were a label on a file folder. He went very still, like a person realizing too late that the water is deeper than it looks. Someone began ushering people toward the kitchen under the pretense of refilling drinks. The room gladly broke into a smaller room. People are brave in groups of 3. From the din, sentences floated back like debris. She should be ashamed. She should have kept it private. She must have known. She always was too composed. The last one was said with admiration made ugly. It said, "We don't like women who can hold themselves together unless they're holding us too." I turned the television off. The room didn't know what to do without the moving pictures to look at, so it looked at me. I picked up the small velvet box with the ring I'd left by the monitor like an offering to a future I hadn't lived yet and slid it into my pocket. I wasn't taking it. I was keeping it. Paige guided me with a palm at my back to the den. We didn't close the door. We didn't hide. Sound found us anyway, muffled, bitter, practical. Paige said, "He's moving fast. This text thread mentions consolidating before you freeze anything. Do you have online copies of the deed, the accounts?" I replied, "Yes. And the originals from my grandmother. They're here." We opened the cabinet where I keep the documents that anchored my life long before I met him. The tin was missing. The lockbox in its place was a cheap substitute, same size, wrong weight. When I lifted it, the lid rattled with an emptiness that felt performative. I said, "They took it." Paige said, "Then we call it theft. We call the bank first. We call the credit bureaus. We call the county recorder." A third notification vibrated, a calendar alert I'd set for myself last week to pick up dry cleaning. The banality of it broke something and fixed something at the same time. Life would continue to ask me to show up for it while I closed the doors this night had opened. We worked quickly, our voices soft, the cadence of logistics. The first bank froze what could be frozen, the second required in-person verification, the third congratulated me on taking control of my financial wellness, the kind of cheerful corporate language that feels like a sticker on a bruise. We documented what we could, photographed the empty box, emailed copies of the nanny cam exports to a new address Paige had created for evidence. My fingers didn't shake. It felt like building a bridge you're also walking across. When we stepped back into the living room, they had rearranged the world without us, as people will. Plates were stacked. Someone had moved the desserts to one side. Glasses congregated near the sink as if proximity to soap made them clean. She stood near the mantel, a hand at her stomach as if to remind us what story we were in now. He hovered, but not quite beside her. Distance in the space that mattered. Their supporters had already formed a small constellation around them, the comfort of gravity even when the star is collapsing. I didn't walk toward them. I went to the table and cut the citrus cake into neat rectangles, then arranged them on a platter. Folding napkins felt like lighting a candle at a vigil for an honest past. I offered the plate to the closest cluster of people without looking up. Nobody took one. Their hands were already full of opinions. He said, "So what now?" I replied, "Now I go to bed in my own house." He scoffed, a tiny sound that had injured me 100 times over the years, weaponizing smallness. It didn't land tonight. The house had chosen. On the console by the entryway, stage, witness, altar, the nanny cam blinked its little LED like a metronome. Steady. Present. Unapologetic. I reached over and powered it down. The next part of the story wouldn't need an audience that couldn't keep its hands to itself. As the first guests began to leave, they did that thing people do when they want to be neutral but also want to live to gossip another day. Brush of a hand on my arm. Murmured, "Take care of yourself." Kiss that didn't quite land. A few looked me in the eye and gave me the smallest nod, their own private vote for the truth. He didn't move. She planted herself, as if roots could appear by proclamation. I passed by both of them, not to exit but to stand in the doorway that had framed so much of this evening and feel its border against my shoulder. A threshold is an instruction. It tells you what you're leaving and what you're entering. It doesn't tell you how to carry it. Paige said, behind me, "Come stay with me tonight." I replied, "No. I'm sleeping here." I pressed my thumb to the deadbolt and turned it. It clicked, a sound so small you could mistake it for anything. His shoulders lifted and then settled, the animal awareness of a door becoming a wall. In the den, my laptop screen had gone to sleep. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped once, twice, then remembered itself and stopped. In my pocket, the ring pressed against my palm, not asking anything of me, not promising anything either. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exact. When I turned back to the room, he finally spoke in a tone I hadn't heard all evening, flat, flint against flint. He said, "If you think this ends it, you don't know me." I met his eyes, not to challenge but to put a label on the box I was sealing. I replied, "I do now." The last guest slipped out with the night air. The house held the echo of their absence like a new shape. I stood very still and tasted the quiet that arrives after the truth has been seen and before the consequences knock. The handle turned on the front door. It didn't open. A palm hit the wood once in frustrated surprise, then withdrew. The lock did exactly what I asked it to do. Behind me, Paige's phone chimed once more, an email sliding in with the speed of an emergency flare, a confirmation that someone had tried and failed to change the mailing address on our joint account. I felt the shift, not fear exactly, not relief, but the recognition that the battle I won in that room had already summoned a different kind of fight. I turned off the living room lamp. The hallway lights traced a path to the den like runway markers. The house exhaled. The walls leaned closer, not to crowd me, but to hold. Peace didn't arrive like a parade, it arrived like a room finally exhaling after someone opens a window. I slept a few hours that night, not out of exhaustion but because the house itself seemed to tuck me in, walls steady, locks quiet, air settled. At first light I boiled water for tea in my grandmother's dented kettle, the one that wobbles on the burner and sings a little early. I didn't look for messages. I didn't check if anyone had tried the door again. I stood at the kitchen window with the steam on my face and let the smallest truth rise. I had chosen myself, and the house had heard me. The work of repair started with the simple tasks that never make it into stories. I pulled my credit reports, placed fraud alerts, and wrote down the reference numbers in neat columns. I called the banks and spoke in the calm voice that tends to get results. It's remarkable how quickly systems relax when a woman refuses to perform panic. With Paige on speaker, we walked the sequence like a drill: freeze, document, notify, preserve. By noon, the county clerk had accepted a request to flag the property file, an administrative pause that tells anyone nosing around, not today. The local precinct took the theft report with the careful attention people show when the evidence is organized and the witness is not trying to convince anyone of anything. I handed over copies of stills, a list of dates, an index card on which I'd written exact times. The young detective looked relieved. Sometimes the story doesn't need to be chased around the block. I didn't answer his messages. I didn't answer hers. Their words performed urgency, mine performed silence. Paige told me I wasn't obligated to say anything to anyone, and that permission didn't close my throat, it loosened it. In the late afternoon, I texted one sentence to a number that had once been the first I dialed when something beautiful or ridiculous happened: return the ring and the tin. 5 minutes later, a new message buzzed, measured and oddly formal: left on your porch. I waited until Paige arrived. We went together. The velvet box sat under a dish towel like a stage prop, the ring lay inside, the tiny stone winking at me as if it had been at some long party and wanted to come home. The tin felt light in my hands. Inside, the documents were in the wrong order, but they were there. I didn't try to read meaning into the arrangement. Some messes aren't metaphors, they're just messes. The next days had their own weather. People sorted themselves. Some went quiet in the way of those who prefer conflict to happen 2 houses away. Others sent elaborate paragraphs about morality and forgiveness that read like speeches written in front of a mirror. A few, fewer than I'd once imagined, stood shoulder to shoulder with me without asking for the story to be softened to fit their comfort. When I walked the neighborhood, I noticed who crossed the street and who held my gaze and said simple things like morning. I didn't keep score, but I took notes in the ledger that lives behind my ribs. The balance wasn't about revenge. It was about choosing the currency I was willing to trade in. He tried to control the narrative the way people who fear quiet always try to. Posts appeared and disappeared. Mutual friends reached out to say he was devastated, that he never intended it to happen like this, that I was hurting myself by dragging it out. I didn't need to remind them I hadn't published anything. I let the truth sit on the table like a glass of water. Anyone thirsty could drink. Anyone uninterested could walk past. She sent one message that I did answer, only because it felt like speaking to the future rather than the past. She said, "There's a baby involved. I hope you can find compassion." I replied, "I already have. It's why I'm not participating in your theater." Then I turned off read receipts for good. Paige moved the case from the screen into paper. We filed for separation with a request for exclusive occupancy, a term that sounds combative but really just means, I get to sleep in my own bed without wondering who has a key. The judge granted a temporary order with the matter-of-factness of a person who has seen this situation in many outfits. He found a short-term rental, and his supporters set up a rotation of indignation and casseroles. I imagined the kitchen drawers in that place, empty in the way rooms are empty when their emptiness is new. I didn't wish him cold, but I didn't light a fire for him either. The collateral damage showed up in places I didn't expect. His sister called Paige to apologize, but not to me. It was the kind of apology that acknowledges liability more than harm. A mutual friend texted that her own marriage had cracked in the echo, things they hadn't wanted to look at found them after my living room refused to lie. That hurt in a way I didn't anticipate. I had no interest in being anyone's cautionary tale, but truth doesn't negotiate side effects. Later, months later, I saw her at the farmer's market, hair pulled into a messy knot, buying tomatoes with a look I recognized, someone rebuilding her lists from scratch. We didn't speak. We smiled like women who know the price of learning. I didn't become a different person. The house didn't become a different house. I made small changes that felt like telling the truth with objects. I moved the console table 2 inches to the left and used the space it freed to place a plant my grandmother would have approved of, a stubborn pothose that thrives on being ignored. I took the nanny cam down and put it in a drawer that should have held batteries. The curio cabinet kept its glass. I cleaned it with a rag and vinegar and slid my grandmother's handwritten spice list into a simple frame, leaning it against the back like a quiet doctrine. On the first Saturday I wasn't saving someone else's plans. I rewired the crooked lamp in the den and replaced its shade with one that makes softer circles on the wall. Peace is built in circles. Work changed because I changed the way I moved through it. I stopped saying yes to deadlines that bent me. I stopped cushioning other people's mistakes with my own time. A client called to say a colleague had warned him I could be unyielding now. He meant it as a caution. I heard it as a compliment. I remained good at what I do. That didn't surprise me. On a rainy Tuesday, I drove out to the cemetery and sat with my grandmother the way I used to sit with her in her kitchen, quiet, hands in my lap, a thermos of tea between us. I told her I had set the table and didn't beg anyone to eat from it. I told her the ring was back where it belonged and that I would wear it again when my hand stopped remembering the weight of someone else's fingerprints. A breeze moved through the cedars and dropped 3 needles onto my knee. I took that as approval because I needed approval from somewhere. Grief and gratitude can live in the same pocket without stabbing each other. The legal pieces moved at the speed paper prefers. We divided what could be divided. We sold what didn't belong where it had ended up. When arguments came, I chose the ones worth having and let the rest bruise the air without touching skin. He asked, through counsel, for half of things that weren't half his. We sent back receipts. The tin, the documents, the timestamps did their work without me raising my voice. When it was finally time to sign, the pen felt heavier than it looked. Not because I doubted, but because endings always weigh a little more than beginnings. They carry the freight of all the versions that will not happen now. I didn't wait for a symbolic date to reclaim the ring. One morning, months after the party, I threaded it onto a thin chain and wore it under my sweater as I walked to the bakery 2 blocks over. Nobody saw it but me. It wasn't a badge. It wasn't a battle standard. It felt like a hand on my shoulder from a woman who kept her recipes in pencil so she could adjust for weather. When the baker handed me the bag, he said, "You look lighter today." I said thank you and didn't explain. Healing wasn't dramatic. It showed up as competence returning to my body. I slept without bracing. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations in the shower. I learned how to let a text message sit unread without it vibrating inside me. I bought a small ceramic dish for the key I was keeping and returned the rest to the landlord-shaped envelope they were issued in. Control is sometimes just knowing which objects are yours to touch. On Sundays I walked the long way home, past the park, where kids scraped their knees and got up again in the way we all do, awkward and human. In the end, justice didn't look like a ruined life. It looked like my life, intact, with the sharp edges buffed down by use. They went on, in their way. She had a baby. I mailed a quiet gift, a soft blanket my grandmother knit years ago and never got to give. I didn't sign it, and I didn't check to see if it arrived. The child is not a sentence. The child is a beginning for someone else. He sent an email once, months later, circumspect and full of the right words about growth and regret. I didn't doubt he believed them when he typed them. I didn't answer. Some conversations end not with door slams but with pens lifted off a page. The house filled with different sounds. Laughter that didn't ask to be apologized for. Music low enough to talk over. The kettle's early whistle. Once, I hosted 3 friends for soup and bread at the same table where I'd set plates for people who couldn't tell the truth. We ate slowly. We did not tell our worst stories like competitions. When they left, I washed bowls by hand and let them air dry, listening to the drip turn into stillness. The television in the living room no longer felt like a weapon. It was once again a place where light moved. On the first warm evening of spring, I took the spare keys from the bowl and made a small ceremony of it. I kept the one that opens the front door. I mailed 2 to people who have never taken advantage of a door left unlocked. I returned a 3rd to the person who used to have good reason to carry it and doesn't anymore. I wrote nothing in the envelopes. The gesture said enough. I don't tell this story to collect outrage. I tell it because there is life on the other side of choosing not to be the floor people walk across to avoid stepping in their own mess. There is quiet. There is competence. There is the ordinary holiness of a morning where the only thing you have to decide is whether to use nutmeg or cinnamon. There is a future that takes your hand when you stop reaching back for a past that won't meet you halfway. On the anniversary of absolutely nothing, I drove to the coast. The sky was the color of pewter, and the water worked its steady argument against the rocks. I parked above the dune grass and sat with the engine off, the world moving without me needing to push it. I thought about thresholds and ledgers and the tiny stone that had found its way home. I thought about the way the front door sounds now when it closes, firm, not sharp. I thought about the woman I was on the night the television turned my entryway into a screen, and I felt the gentlest kind of pity for her, the kind that doesn't confuse compassion with permission. When the first star needled the evening, I whispered a thank you that wasn't to anyone in particular. Then I started the car, pointed the headlights toward home, and drove the quiet road back to the life I had chosen. The house would be there, holding its breath the way houses do just before you turn the key, ready to open. I would step over the threshold, not as a woman defined by what had been done to her, but as a woman defined by what she refused to do to herself ever again. What would you have protected first, your peace, your home, or the versions of people you once loved? Tell me where your line is, and how you knew when you'd finally reached it. If these are the kinds of stories that make you think, the ones about quiet strength, the cost of truth, and the dignity of consequences, subscribe and be part of this community.